Okay, this video is part 5 about causes of obesity. We're going to talk a lot about mTOR and the effect of insulin and animal protein on mTOR. So we already talked a lot about insulin, how a high-fat diet causes the blood-brain barrier to have less permeability to leptin, so leptin can't go from the fat up into the brain, and it can't turn off your hunger, so you'll have a tendency to overeat. So high-fat diet leads to overeating, and it moves the set point for your body weight up higher, so it makes you get fat. Okay, that's one of the reasons why it does that. The other thing is dietary fat causes increase in insulin because it causes insulin resistance. And the insulin resistance then causes the accumulation of fat because insulin is an anabolic hormone. It blocks the production of the binding protein for insulin-like growth factor in the blood, so you will get increased insulin-like growth factor. Together, insulin and insulin-like growth factor will activate mTOR. mTOR is called either mammalian or mechanistic target of rapamycin, and it's basically like a nutrient-sensing pathway, like a contractor getting ready to build a building, and it wants to have all the building materials available before it starts to build. So once all the insulin and insulin-like growth factor up, it's got all the fat that it needs to build. Animal protein in particular tends to have a lot more leucine than does plant protein, and leucine tends to be the rate-limiting step amongst amino acids for activation of mTOR. Okay, so other things you don't want are going to happen when insulin is elevated. For example, you'll get increased activation of the sympathetic autonomic nervous system, usually abbreviated SANS, S-A-N-S, sympathetic autonomic nervous system. That'll cause increased sodium resorption from the kidney, which will tend to cause hypertension because that inhibits endothelial nitric oxide. And it also will tend to cause increased urinary excretion of magnesium, which is your vasodilator that you want. Okay, so I previously had mentioned there's a great video on YouTube about the Banting Award. It's actually from 2018 of Shulman. And this guy, Roy Taylor, he's a Banting Award winner in 2012. He's got YouTube videos as well. Okay, we talked about things that cause insulin resistance. Here's the list if you want to review it. I went over it in the last video. We're going to show some more papers along these lines and some new stuff. We're going to get into new stuff definitely with this talk here. Okay, here's a couple papers where there's air pollution, a lot of air pollution. There's increased obesity and increased insulin resistance. So here's just showing how that's a risk factor right there. So you don't want to live right next to a smelly factory or right next to a road where there's a lot of car exhaust. And you don't want to live right next to a really noisy thing like an airport where there's, not to mention the pollution, there's also the loud noise making it harder to sleep. Children have a lower IQ when they grow up next to an airport with all that noise. Okay, salt inactivates endothelial nitric oxide synthase, so ENOS, endothelial NOS, nitric oxide synthase. So nitric oxide is the big vasodilator released by the endothelial cells lining all the arteries. So when you inhibit that, you get vasoconstriction. And the vasoconstriction means that you have less blood flow to that tissue, for example, the skeletal muscle. So here's just showing a cell. This is a neuron in particular, but any cell, they all are going to have this potassium sodium ATPase. Usually people will say the sodium first. They'll call it the sodium potassium ATPase. I like to put the potassium first because it's a reminder that's what's coming into the cell, and then 3 sodiums are pumped out. And that's how a cell maintains its electric gradient across its plasma membrane. And you need to have a big gradient of sodium because the pumping out of calcium is coupled to taking sodium in. There's a lot more of these than there are of these. This is called a NACA exchanger, N-A-C-A, NACA, for sodium-calcium exchanger. And so what I'm saying is when you have high dietary sodium and low dietary potassium, which is a meat and a processed food diet, you start to accumulate too much sodium inside the cell, which weakens the gradient to run this exchanger. And it'll lead to the net effect of having increased calcium accumulating in cells, especially your skeletal muscle cells. And that accumulation of calcium in your skeletal muscle cells will cause them to have prolonged contraction. When I say skeletal muscle, I meant vascular smooth muscle cells. Vascular smooth muscle cells. And so that'll maintain higher tone in your vascular smooth muscle cells, causing hypertension. It'll do other things too, but hypertension was the topic of the moment. Okay, so adding salt to meals is a risk factor for type 2 diabetes. And also the salt makes things taste better, so you eat more. If you reduce dietary sodium, it's associated with that helping to lower the hemoglobin A1C. Hemoglobin A1C is a measure, like let's say your diabetes blood glucose control over the past 3 months, the amount of glycation of the hemoglobin. That's also partly why they think red blood cells get stiffer with time towards 120 days, because they're progressively more glycated. Now here's some good things to know. Why is magnesium so important for all these ATP reactions? Because these phosphates are highly negatively charged. They're repelling each other, and the positive charge, they're highly negative charge, and the magnesium having a positive charge helps to hold them together. So you always need magnesium for these ATP cytoplasm reactions. Where does magnesium come from? Look, it's in the center of chlorophyll. You get that from eating plants. And so like I said in one of the earlier lectures about causes of obesity, all the good stuff comes from plants. P for plants, P for potassium. Magnesium right from the center of chlorophyll. Whereas when you eat a processed food, it tends to have lots of sodium. And the meat's often preserved with sodium as well. So all the bad stuff comes from a meat and processed food diet. That's an important point to know. Like we were briefly mentioning earlier, hyperinsulinemia from insulin resistance, so high insulin in the blood, causes increased activation of the sympathetic autonomic nervous system, SANS. SANS elevation causes urinary loss of magnesium, so you lose your vasodilator. And it also causes increased reabsorption of what you don't want, your sodium, the vasoconstrictor. So you get more hypertension, and you're kind of trapped in a vicious cycle that's only going to get worse. This is a diagram showing all the things that need magnesium to run. There's tons and tons of biochemical pathways in your cells that need magnesium to run. So when you're deficient in magnesium, which is one of the most common nutrient deficiencies in Western diets, these are lack of potassium, lack of magnesium, and a lack of fiber. Those are the 3 big ones. So anyways, this is just a rough idea of all the biochemical systems that are suffering from a magnesium deficiency. So you don't need to take a magnesium supplement. You just need to eat more plants. That's what I do. I mean, I know some people take a magnesium supplement, maybe if your magnesium's really low. It's a little bit difficult to measure. That's sort of a topic for a different day, but you get my point. Eat your plants, get your magnesium, you'll be better off. Okay, serum and dietary potassium. So if you're low in potassium, you'll have increased risk of diabetes. So there it is. Low in magnesium, low in potassium, increased risk of diabetes. High in sodium, more diabetes. So the good stuff's from plants, potassium and magnesium. Artificial sweeteners are bad. This is just one paper showing a mechanism where the artificial sweetener with its very sweet taste in the mouth, sort of tricking the pancreas, if you will, leading to the pancreas releasing increased insulin. And when the pancreas releases increased insulin, but there's no glucose in the blood to account for that sweet taste, the cells eventually recognize there's a problem here, and they start to protect themselves by developing insulin resistance. So the net result is going to be promoting fat storage. Elevated blood insulin promotes fat storage. It's an anabolic hormone. It promotes storage of fat. It blocks the breakdown of fat, lipolysis. So you're basically screwing yourself. And who drinks artificial sweeteners? It's the fat lady. Okay, mTOR is somewhat like insulin in some ways. They're both anabolic. They both promote fat storage. The animal protein has more branched-chain amino acids. In particular, the most important one is leucine. This is why the bodybuilders will want to take branched-chain amino acids, because they want that leucine to help them build their muscle faster. But for a regular person, especially a person over 40, you don't want frequent unnecessary activation of mTOR, because it's going to accelerate cell replication, increasing your risk of dying from cancer. It's also going to increase the store of lipid. Here's mTOR type 1. We don't really care about mTOR type 2. For our purposes, mTOR type 1 is what matters. It's going to block lipolysis, meaning blocks the breakdown of fat. And it stimulates, the blue arrow stimulates lipogenesis, meaning the production of fat, the storage of fat. Okay, so you can activate mTOR either by having more animal protein with the elevated leucine, or you can activate it by having increased insulin and insulin-like growth factor from eating the high-fat diet, and also these electrolyte things we just talked about, being high in sodium, low in magnesium and potassium. So you don't want to be activating mTOR. It's just good to kind of know how that works. You can think of mTOR as a seesaw. Basically, so here's mTOR. And it promotes growth and cell replication, accelerates aging, accelerates the rate at which you reach the Hayflick limit. And all of these things are the things you usually don't want. So excessive dietary fat leading to excessive insulin and ILGF, Animal protein with all its leucine. Estrogenic chemicals will also promote weight gain. Being sedentary tends to promote poor health and a little bit weight gain. Insomnia is a stress equivalent, so the stress hormones are also going to promote weight gain. And the point is, you want to spend more time in what I would call like a maintenance phase. After you exercise, it lowers your energy stores. And this pathway is called the AMPK pathway, and I'm sort of writing it out a little longer, the AMP associated protein kinase pathway. So AMP comes from adenosine monophosphate. So the M is for mono. We're used to seeing a T here, and that's for adenosine triphosphate. So after you exercise, your energy is somewhat depleted, and that depleted energy of the AMP activates this protein kinase pathway, and it's a good thing because what it basically says, the cell is saying, we cannot replicate at this time. We just need to restore our AP energy supplies, and so this will shut off mTOR. So this is the perfect thing to do if you've got cancer, to shut off mTOR, to shut off cell replication. And you'll see it's a common pattern in a lot of these people who survived metastatic cancer. They exercise a lot. Like Ruth Heydrich, PhD, is the most famous one. And, you know, she's written books like Senior Moments, and she's been interviewed before a lot on the internet, like on Chef AJ, for example. So she's a very heroic lady. I actually have a picture of her in my bathroom, inspiring. You know, here's this lady, 80 years old, and she says, I work out every day. And I'm like, God, this 80-year-old lady works out every day. I better work out some today. So another really famous lady who exercises a ton, who survived metastatic breast cancer for decades, is that Janet Murray Wakelin. She's the one who wrote the book Raw Cures Cancer, and she literally ran a marathon every day all around the perimeter of Australia, 365 marathons in 365 days. Pretty amazing. I read her book. I read both their books. Their books are good. You know, both of them are smart, know what they're talking about. Okay, and both, you know, what do? They went low-fat vegan, and they exercised like crazy, and they managed their stress and all those other psychological things to optimize their attitude of gratitude and resilience. People have been asking me a little bit about resilience lately, and, you know, you want to simplify your life, focus on the few things that are important to you, have an attitude of gratitude. I think religion helps a lot. It's pretty well known that religious people are a lot healthier. So anyways, all those things lower one's stress level. Okay, just a little bit more on mTOR, showing how insulin-like growth factor activate mTOR, leucine activates mTOR, methionine contributes to the activation of mTOR. There's a lot more methionine in meat as well. So meat has a different amino acid composition than do plant foods. And the methionine and leucine both contribute to activation of mTOR, mTOR1. Here's another thing mTOR does that I don't like. mTOR will block the insulin receptor, so it's going to worsen diabetes. It's going to increase insulin resistance. So what I'm really saying here is animal protein will cause increased insulin resistance through its activation of mTOR and subsequent blocking of the insulin receptor pathway. And it accelerates cell replication, so it causes accelerated aging in adults. You don't want it. All right, so that's a good thing to realize. And the other thing, too, we talked about it is, for social things, you can use social thinking. Social thinking a lot of times is go with the flow, everything in moderation. You know, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. But for nutrition and health, man, you want to think biblical, religious, 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not eat meat. Thou shalt not eat oils. Thou shalt not eat processed foods, especially industrial fructose. Thou shalt avoid obesogens, because that's what gets you healthy. You know, the sort of the half-ass effort, it doesn't get you healthy. And a lot of people, they mix these things up. And you have to understand, most people don't age well. Most people don't get better. That's why they call them a chronic disease, because the patients usually never get better. And the other thing that is not widely recognized is how many people are cognitively impaired. I was just recently talking with a lady internal medicine doctor, and she said it's so sad. She said most of her patients over 60 years of age, they're cognitively impaired, especially her diabetics. She said they're so mentally slow. It's sad. It's pathetic. And so I'm just telling you, you don't want to end up like that. And I've known for a long time, because, you know, I read a lot, and I'll look at the course of an author's career. I'll often read multiple books by the same author, and I'll see a lot of them deteriorate as they get older. But it doesn't have to be that way. There's some writers who wrote magnificent books in their late 70s and 80s. You know, like Victor Hugo had a masterpiece in his older years. Okay, this is just stuff we talked about. What activates mTOR and having increased leucine and methionine, especially the stuff that comes from meat. There's also more lysine in meat. How do you decrease mTOR? By eating 100% plant-based, no animal protein. I would maybe even lower my plant protein if I had cancer. I don't, but if I did or I was worried about it, I would do that too. But plant protein's a lot safer because there's a lot less leucine and methionine. There's also less lysine. Okay, decrease your dietary fat to avoid insulin resistance. Exercise a lot to activate the AMPK pathway, which shuts off mTOR because the cell senses that it's low in energy. Oh, this is just showing potatoes are super low in leucine. Talking again about leucine and activation of mTOR. Here's the AMPK pathway. Exercise activates that. Exercise does other good things too. Exercise gets your lymphatic fluid flowing so your white blood cells can surveil the immune system, helps you to sleep better. Insulin and sympathetic, we already talked about this, how high levels of insulin, let's say due to high-fat diet, will increase sympathetic autonomic nervous system, causing sodium reabsorption, causing hypertension. Okay. One interesting thing about stress response, short acute stress tends to be more of a catecholamine effect, epinephrine, norepinephrine, same thing as adrenaline, noradrenaline, versus chronic prolonged stress tends to be more of a cortisol effect. Cortisol, of course, causes obesity, insulin resistance, visceral fat accumulation. Okay, so that's the end of part 5, causes of obesity.